Hello everybody and welcome to the review vlog for Parasyte. I know this was delayed quite a bit, but it's here now, so that's the main focus. But let's just immediately get on with this because I'll try to make this short and sweet and easy to digest. So in short, this was a show that I thoroughly enjoyed for several reasons, but mainly because it was entertaining the whole way through. Now, I have some contestants about the show, and there are certain aspects of it that I really feel conflicted about, such as the fact that the show is characterized as horror. While it certainly does have some horror elements, I would not characterize this show as a horror show just in general sense. However, it certainly does carry those themes, and to people who are less accustomed to horror stories, it certainly could be characterized, and it certainly could feel and act as a horror story, and that certainly could be pretty good. However, I feel like that the general feeling of the story, general motive, and all that, it is far more uplifting, and it's definitely nowhere as in... It is definitely not an Asian horror story, because those tend to end on a sour note, on a more melodramatic tone, whereas more Western horror stories end in this kind of manner. In general, the whole feeling of the show is a far bit more Western, and in the way that there's general messages about the bad of the evils of humanity and all that. But the general theming in Western horror shows is to end on a high note to leave the audience feeling safe. And that is certainly something that the show does create, because it leaves you off with a good feeling of satisfaction and fulfillment. So that's a little point there. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own share of tense moments, and it certainly does have elements which I really quite liked, and it has its own share of nightmare fuel, even though those are not quite as, shall we say, expressive as they were in the manga, which I went back and took some looks at, but they are still done quite well, and there are especially some parts of the show which are really rather effective at creating tension. But it's tension, it's obvious tension. It's not something that I would really describe as horror. But I've been going about the horror theming quite a bit. So how does the show fare up just as a show on its own? And to that I'll do the usual breaking down. On the visual design department, the show is designed as a pseudo-realistic. It has the general anime look, and that's fine enough. It's not the most unrealistic. The characters do not have the most unrealistic proportions, which is fine enough, and it creates an unsettling amount of familiarity towards the characters. They do look rather human, and it's far more easy to relate to them. And where this actually shines through quite well is especially on the design department, on the design of the parasites, because they certainly do lack certain expressions, which really creates an uncanny valley effect in a very effective manner, and it's done on purpose. Clearly, there's a clear distinction between the emotions and expressions of a parasite and a human, mainly that the parasites are lacking them, at least most of the time, and when they are expressing themselves, they do it more with voice, and it's done in a fantastical manner. You can just take a look at some of the episodes, and where new characters are being introduced, and you can clearly see that. And that's certainly an aspect that I liked, the uncanny valley effect of the parasites trying to emote as humans. Certainly some of the parasites do act far more human, but none of them are actually, like, even close to being humane, so even in their expression, especially in their expressions, so mostly only in some of their actions, such as the woman whose name I completely forgot. I should have actually taken far more notes. Anyway, the show certainly looks really good. Like, the graphical design department did a very good job on this. The animation is very fluid and smooth for most of the time, and it especially fits the action scenes quite well. There are surprisingly few just purely static shots, and where they do when they do have static shots and shots that do not have a lot of sakuga, where they don't have any movement, and when they are clearly where it's clearly noticeable that they were able to skimp on the animation budget, it was done not only to save on the animation budget, but also to prolong the effects of certain tragic moments where they could just hold a still image, and that still image would be far more effective if it were than when it was a still image than when it was moving. So the stillness of the image added to the effect of it. So, you know, they didn't skimp out on the budget in wrong situations, in my opinion. Though there are certainly some scenes, like if we were to nitpick, there are certainly scenes where the movement of the characters is very minimal, but they are still not static, so it's not... The animation budget was spent wisely, in my opinion, in this show, and especially since it was mostly spent on the animating the wonderful action scenes, and those are certainly fantastic to look at, and that's where it should be focused on. But it's not like they skimped out on any mundane moments, and they certainly put a lot of emphasis on creating scenes that are heavy and are visually rather interesting. And there are certainly a lot of interesting visual tricks that are done throughout the show, which certainly which emphasize Shinichi's descent or straying away from humanity and his struggling of the two natures of him being pseudo-human and pseudo-parasite. It's an interesting it's a thing that's shown very interestingly with the visual effects. Although more in the audio department, but still in the visual side it's also shown quite well. So yeah, the visual side of the show is really fantastic. It's really good. It's nothing mind-blowing, but it's definitely good. And definitely wisely managed. I didn't look up the budget of the show, but it is definitely, like, it doesn't look cheap. And that's the main point. Then on the audio design department, this is where I feel conflicted, because there are certainly few good songs in the show, like Next to You, and there is that other song, which name I can't remember, but there are at least two really good tracks on the show that distinctly still stick in my mind, like Sore Thumb, because those are really good. They are really effective emotional moments, so effective songs, and those are really used quite well, and I feel like they are not overused in the show, at least in my opinion. They could be for some, but in my opinion they are not overused. However, those are only two tracks, and there are more tracks, and let's just say that some of them really make it seem far more cartoony and far more... They make the show feel far more cartoony and silly. Yeah, just flat out silly. And I highlighted that in one of the episodes that I did, so, you know, there's that. Still, it's not as if they completely botched it, but I feel conflicted about whether I should praise the show for its audio design or not. It's not bad, definitely, but it has very mixed results. Still, it's nothing like it's never too grating or anything like that, and in tense moments it's fine enough. It's definitely nothing that detracts from the show too much, so we'll just give it a pass. It's nothing bad, and it has some frankly beautiful songs, so, you know, there's that. Now on the voice acting side, this is also always something that I have very little experience to speak of, so I can't really give it a proper analysis here, but I can just say that nothing really stuck out too poorly. there might have been some minor characters that were not quite as good, but since I watched it with the original dub, the Japanese dub that is, or voice acting, whatever, it wasn't too bad. And since I don't understand Japanese, it really makes a big difference for me, because that makes the difference between bad and good voice actors far more blurry, and that's fine enough. That's fine enough. I don't care about it too much. Voice acting is something that I rarely complain about, so this is again where I have very little to say about. Sound effects, there's nothing to note. There's very little to note. Maybe they used an excessive amount of whirling wind noises, because that happened a lot, and clashing metal, but those are sound effects that have very little distinction between them. So, and there's very little that can be done with them, so that's something where it's kind of pointless to complain about it, because it's very hard to do anything distinct with those. And to the benefit of the creative team, at least the audio mixing was good enough that the sound effects really didn't detract from the show too much, and they really muted them enough so that the audio could be heard, or the dialogue could be heard quite well, and especially the music could be heard quite well, but the sound effects still, you notice that they were in there, but they definitely didn't mess up the music or the dialogue, so that they were still distinct. That's an audio mixing thing, and that's something that's easily botched, and it wasn't botched, in my opinion. Yeah. Now, the general story of the show is something... It's interesting. It's definitely interesting. There's a lot of stories of aliens coming to Earth, and there's a lot of mind control stories and things like this, but the central focus of the story is something that's kind of... It's a story that can be personally interpreted in many ways. Anyone can have a different opinion of what the general message of the story is, but generally the story is about cohabitation and living together with another species, and in the grand scheme of things, about humanity taking advantage of nature, and how humanity kind of has a toxic nature, but also about how humanity is not only a plague on the planet, but also, a crucial part of it. It's an interesting message, and it's something that's been played out quite a bit, but frankly, since that didn't end up being the final message of the show, in my opinion, that wasn't something... It was just a fear I had for the latter half of the show, that the show would turn out to be another show, would be another show with just the core message of humanity bad, because that hasn't been played out to the death already. But fortunately, that wasn't what the show turned out to be, so, or at least that's how I interpret it. It's a fine enough general story. It serves perfectly functionally, and what I especially liked was when the Parasyte who had 3 or later on 5 parasites in him, when he was revealed, it kind of started turning out to be like there was a kind of a gotcha moment, or a fake switch of direction in the story, that it started to turn towards being a Parasite of the Week style of show, which fortunately it did not, but that was a good moment there, where you would think that they would start just hunting every single parasite down one by one. And that would have been an interesting change of direction, but I think that would have been ultimately a bad way for the show to go, or the story to go, so anyways. Since the parasites were ultimately wiped out by, the police forces, except for Goto, which, had an impressive way to go out, but the humanity showed its brutal effectiveness by wiping out majority of the parasites, or a good chunk of them, and the rest went into hiding. So, yeah. Anyways, I really liked that the story didn't. I liked where the story went and how it had a fake switch of direction for a 2-3 episode period. And that was fine enough. I like that. And then finally we got to the final arc with Goto and how Shinichi and Migi would finally, or could finally, or possibly could defeat him, and how he ended up being defeated by, surprise, humanity. It's, or kind of, it's, regardless, it's a rather interesting thing, and I quite liked how the story went, in general, and how the show didn't turn out to be preachy. Now, the characters of the show are generally rather rather simple. Now, the two most important characters, or three actually, if we are talking about Goto, most important characters, Shinichi and Migi, are certainly, they are the focus of the show, and that's where most of the creative focus on the characters is focused. They are the two most unique characters of the show, and that's exactly how it should be. And I really quite liked how they were portrayed, and especially how Shinichi changed throughout the show, because that's really crucial, because the show is so much about evolution and adaptation and those kinds of overall themes. It's really crucial that Shinichi changes throughout the show. And he changes in various ways, not only in physical and mental level, also psychological level, and just in so many different ways, and he changes quite often as well, so. But he doesn't change just out of the blue. It always has natural progression, and there's always shown that time passes between when he changes, so. His changes are portrayed naturally, and just in general, I liked how his character evolved throughout the show. That's not to disparage Migi, of course, who is a central character who had less evolution. His character changed less during the show, but he had a very crucial role to play, mostly as an anchor for Shinichi's character to change around. And his minor changes, well, not to say though, I kind of want to say that Migi didn't change at all. He did, but he did ultimately change, but he changed very little. But what little change happened, it was nice, especially in comparison to Shinichi and how well he complemented. And especially the interplay between these two characters was something rather crucial. And Migi's original purpose, compared to how Migi turned out in the end, and that contrasting with Goto just in general, that's one of the crucial and most interesting aspects of the finale of the show, and something I quite liked. Now, Goto himself is not unique as a character. He's rather stereotypical, a feral creature, could we say. But that's not to say that he isn't imposing. He's just rather stereotypical, but he's imposing and threatening, and creates a really good final enemy for the pair to face off against. And especially how Migi finally survives or revives and shows up in the climax. That is fantastic. And the ironic twist how Goto dies is also something it's an interesting way to go out on. It's an interesting note to go out on, and it also kind of ferments the message that the show had, which could be taken as a negative downside that it's kind of going into the bridge direction once again in that ending, although not necessarily though. It could be taken in few different ways, but it was certainly an ironic way to go out on. And I really just generally liked Goto as the final villain. He was certainly, mostly because he was very imposing. That's generally something good for a final villain to be, unless you're going for some kind of satire or some kind of... Well, there's a few reasons to have a different kind of final villain, but for this kind of story, that kind of final villain is pretty good. Now, the other characters, they range from just very generic to barely passable, so I'm not gonna talk too much about them. Now, their female supporting characters were actually surprisingly good, and the other parasites, or at least those who had more personality to them, those were certainly some characters that were enjoyable, especially the female parasite, whose name I still can't remember. She was certainly one of the most interesting characters. But just in general, the characters they range the gambit from, from kind of bad to pretty good in the case of Shinichi. Yeah. Now, in general, do I like the show? Yes, I really do like the show, and I probably will watch it again, because it's a very well-paced show. It has a lot of good pacing to it, and it really doesn't drag out too much. And especially when you're binging it, it's a show that's really hard to put down, as I experienced numerous times. If there's something that I will give the show a lot of credit for, it is doing pacing really damn well between episodes and in episodes, because the episodes really are paced so that the first 5 minutes really kind of subtly drag you into the show, and then 10 minutes pass without you even noticing, and the final 5 minutes are almost always a really good climax in almost every single episode. And it's really hard to put the show down between episodes, because the cliffhangers are often quite good. Although there are a few episodes that naturally they end arcs, so they just have an ending. They don't have a cliffhanger ending. So those are natural leaving points, or at least they are points where you can take a break. So I really do recommend the show. It's pretty good. It's pretty freaking good. It has some flaws to it, and taken the wrong way, the message is overdone and overplayed, and not delivered exceptionally well. And it isn't very philosophical in that manner, or psychological even, but, it's entertaining. And if you're just looking for an entertaining show, I think Parasyte certainly passes quite well. And if you're just looking something to kill your time, then Parasyte is really freaking cool. Like, it really serves as entertainment. It definitely serves as really good entertainment, even though it isn't. It has a lot of elements to it which I wish they had more focus on, but it also has a lot of elements which are something that surprised me rather well, such as the action scenes. I didn't really remember the manga having such good action scenes, and looking back at them, they were not this good. The manga definitely doesn't have such good action scenes. It has far more of a horrific tone to it, but the anime certainly has a more entertainment tone to it. So, take that as you may. Now, I thank you all very much for watching. I hope to see you join me in my next show that I'll be doing, whatever I'll be doing. Anyway, thank you. I hope this was somewhat entertaining and interesting. Have a great day and stay awesome. Genmu out. Thanks for watching.